Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Candyman is, without doubt, 1992's Candyman, I should say, for clarification now, is one of the great cinematic horror features. And I would definitely say one of the greatest horror films of the last 30 years. In terms of representation of slasher films, there is a maturity and quality to it that I hadn't anticipated going into the viewing. And there are so many layers in respect of storytelling, subtext, and character building that it really does show the ability of horror to mean more than just basic chills and scares. I've talked extensively about how, to me, horror is a much stronger platform when it tries to discuss complex and rich themes and ideas. That I have always been in the school of thought that when going to a horror film, one shouldn't simply be made to jump or sort of throw their popcorn in the theatre. That the true quality of a horror film is the kind of film that leaves, when the audience leaves, they leave either in silence or in contemplation of what they've seen, with ideas and images that stick with people. You know, because it is the sort of fast food banquet type dichotomy where, you know, if it's one thing to get fast food and it fills you for the moment, but it's another thing to have a true dining experience where you're left remembering certain dishes and tastes and flavours and richness. And I think horror, of all cinema genres, is one that can really show the richness and complexity within its style. Because I mean, Candyman isn't the scariest horror ever. It's not about, oh, this one left me shaking or this one left me affected. But considering that this is sort of during the 90s era of horror, this is a slasher, it's a ghost story, it sort of hits all those elements that one would think is ripe for very simple, basic storytelling. I've talked several times about my frustrations with the 1990s as being one of the weakest eras within horror, where the classic monsters and slashers that had become franchises had really started to be stretched out by the time we reached the 90s. The nastiness of video nasties of the 70s had started to sort of lose their novelty by the 90s. And we'd reached this period where everything was more analytical and self-reflexive. You know, this is where, of course, Wes Craven was making films like Scream, or the Nightmare on Elm Street sequel or reboot that he did, you know, which are much more analysing horror rather than being true representations. I will argue for Scream insofar as, yes, it is a true representation, but the self-analysis obviously means that there's only so much you can invest in a narrative whilst sort of considering the mechanics of it. And so the 90s is a period where we really were struggling to get true, good quality mainstream horror. And as I say, I associate that time with a lack of originality and quality and representation. And yet Candyman stands out as a jewel in the rough of that period. Because, I don't know, there's something about it, the use of colour and tone, the fact that there is a very delicate pace to it, a very intentional sense of taking its time in building the narrative before we really delve into the horror genre, the slasher genre. Because, I mean, the film begins... Actually, the best way to approach this, I suppose, is where it comes to the story, half of it is almost a drama. It's almost a traditional psychological drama with social commentary and a slightly darker, more twisted subtext going on and you know, use of storytelling. And so it spends this huge period of the film establishing Helen Lyle and establishing the world that exists around her, and then of course establishing the community that she's examining. And like I say, there's something almost of the drama about it, where smartly, rather than just not giving us anything, it opens with a slasher style scene that's much more traditional. But that scene is actually a story that a character is telling Helen. And once we'd have that more traditional, basic horror slasher setup, the film slows down massively and takes its time to create a sense of atmosphere and setting. I mean, I say that it's not about storytelling, about metatext, and it's not self-explanatory like in the way that films like Scream are, and yet it's a film about stories and the power of stories and storytelling. The idea that, you know, we take human tragedy and create lore and mythology around it, so that we take genuinely horrifying events that, were they to happen to a person in real life, would be this legacy would leave a legacy of horror. And yet, because of this legacy of horror, people end up mythologizing and turning it into something that is more than just a human tragedy. As I say, there's so many layers that this film has in talking about, you know, there's a lot of text and subtext about gentrification, racial representation, the American oppression of the black community, that frankly it's one of the kinds of films that you could watch again and again and see new layers to it. You get that sense, the fact that Helen is a white woman going, you know, and a sort of middle class intellectual, essentially walking into this community and just almost appropriating what she wants for self-serving reasons. And the idea that she just sort of takes these people's lives and uses it to examine this narrative that she's interested in studying. And of course you have that, you know, the sort of the commentary that exists there. Like, there's other levels, like the fact that, you know, it makes a case, you know, it shows and tells, but more importantly shows the fact that you have the conversation about her apartment and the apartment in Green Groves, the fact that it's you know, they're the same build, and yet because one is in this downtrodden community, it's therefore seen as less valuable. And there's just this sense of oppression and the different representations of a community underfoot, and how the Candyman exists because, not because he's a monster in the way that, say, Freddy Krueger is, although I think there is more to that as well, but he is more symbolic of institutional abuses and the suffering of a community who don't have a voice to be able to express their suffering, and so they create this unspeakable monster that children sort of are scared to say the name of. But then the film very intelligently takes Helen and shows her oppression, and so we don't just get a representation of racial oppression and suffering. We then cross that over with the suffering, a feminist suffering. The idea of this woman who's in an academic field, who, you know, she should be middle class, she's intelligent, and yet misogyny and the patriarchy are constantly oppressing her. You know, she has this partner who is very clearly, if not having an affair, has at least a wandering eye, and there is something of the philanderer about him, and there is something also of the sort of the patronising relationship that he has with her. The other intellectuals who constantly demean her, and you get those constant microaggressions, and you just get these moments of true, like, not just sexist, but like oppressive crushing of her spirit. And the idea, of course, that once we get into the second half and it becomes intensely more psychological, we move away from sort of the representation of racial suffering and appropriation and exploitation, and go more into sort of the ways in which women are undermined and exploited. You know, you have the sort of degradation moments, the fact that she is eventually sent to a mental asylum, the fact that you have that scene when, after she's believed to have committed the murder of Bridget, I think it is, you know, where she's forced to strip whilst, you know, under police examination, and yet there is something so horribly degrading about degrading about it. And again, it just shows sort of how the Candyman, because there is this sense, and when you get into the Candyman sequels, unfortunately the focus shifts to the wrong things. And of course, when it comes to storytelling and sequel storytelling and franchise building, there is the unfortunate relationship of focusing on the superficial elements rather than the deeper, more complex subtext. So of course, where it comes to the Candyman, everyone focuses on things like, of course, saying the 5 names in the mirror. They focus on the sort of the whole relationship of sort of reincarnation and the cyclical relationship that the Candyman has with the protagonist of each film. The idea that there's a sort of continuing cycle where, is it actual reincarnation? It's left ambiguous, and yet people, especially in the sequels, treat it as though it is, and that's not an interesting takeaway. It's a very surface level reading, because it's not really about that. It's about the fact that Candyman symbolises people using this, what was once a person, but he's not a person, he is a symbol. And so therefore for Helen he becomes a symbol. And that's why the film is a great tragedy, and is all about the inevitability that when we get to the climax and she sees her own face in the mural, in the face of the woman that Renault once loved, it's not supposed to be an indication of, oh, is she a reincarnation in this woman? It's no, she represents the oppression and abuses that people have suffered. And so therefore the Candyman is imbuing upon her traits that are universal. That's the beautiful relationship of this. And I think that's the way that, you know, when it comes to the Candyman, the sort of story that's being told is so much richer and more complex than just a straight slasher, or just a film about this demonic presence who wants to take this woman and take this woman as her bride. And it does have the imagery of things like the Candyman coming out the coffin. It has a very Francis Ford Coppola Dracula element to it, where there is almost this romance style to it, where he is courting her. And yet, as I say, it's not supposed to be taken literally, or at least my reading and an more interesting reading of it is that it's not supposed to be taken literally. It's supposed to represent these much more complex ideas of imagery and representation of suffering, and rather than the sort of reincarnation of a person, it's more like the cyclical relationship that people have in their, of oppression, of the oppression of the black community and black people individually, and the oppression of women. And that makes it so much more interesting. And so when you get to the point, and this is a spoiler for the end of Candyman, although I've already talked about the third act, but when you get to the ending, and the idea, and we then have the return, Helen's spirit return as Candyman once did to murder her ex-husband, you get that sense of, that is the tragedy, because despite the fact that a superficial reading will say, well, she kills the Candyman in the fire, and she rescues the baby, so therefore she's given a heroic ending. The final scene indicates that, no, it's a tragic one, that she has taken on the attributes of the Candyman, and so therefore she perpetuates the mythology, and the mythologization of her will continue on into the future, and so therefore the Candyman will live again through Helen Lyle. And as I say, this is such a rich film, and it's the kind of film that I'd want to write about before discussing. I've talked before about how I would love, with some of these films, to actually go away, instead of doing videos on the day of watching them, that I would love to go away for a week and write a considered thought piece, because this is the kind of film that deserves think pieces and real essays about different interpretations and of course different texts based on eras, how it would be read in 1992 compared to how it would be read now in 2021. And again, I just think, you have a great central relationship between Helen and the Candyman. Tony Todd imbues so much atmosphere. And so even though you have these horrifying slasher moments, and you have these more sort of sinister, these sort of psychological, overwhelming moments, Tony Todd is even dangerous in the moments where he's almost trying to be romantic and courting, or at least in the way that the Candyman is. The scene in the car park is probably one of the most terrifying scenes, because there's just something so almost charming within the horror about him. And as I say, this is the kind of the way that something like this should be told. I was talking about Freddy Krueger earlier, and the fact that, of course, by the time you hit the 90s, Freddy is a joke. He's a joke character. Whereas when you go back to the original, it's the idea of trauma, and the idea that it doesn't matter whether a spirit is real or not. It's the idea of trauma living through generations, and the idea of child abuse and the long-lasting effects of child abuse beyond the abuse itself. And in the same way with the Candyman, it's the idea of trauma and oppression, and the idea of hate crimes and social oppression of black people and of women, and the ideas how these people are treated, the long-lasting generational and cyclical nature of this story being repeated again and again, and the Candyman needing to exist because he takes on and embodies the horror of this kind of trauma. It is a great film. It is genuinely such a great film and a great horror that I cannot believe I've slept on all this time. It's, like I say, it's not the scariest in the world. It has moments of true horror, but it's more the storytelling and the implications and the idea that it leaves you with so much to think about. And I just think it's great. And it means I'm looking forward to then seeing Candyman 2021, which, if I do this rightly, will follow up directly after this video. So we'll see whether the 2021 film lives up to the original, especially following the two sequels that I won't watch and discuss here, but are somewhat lackluster, and even the little I am aware of them, as I say, they don't fully understand the what is being said in this original film. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that, and I'll line them up, so then I'll be able to talk about 2021 and whether it continues the legacy properly. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because it's all help with the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded, and check out my back catalogue of over 200 videos. I'm coming close to the 250 videos, so I may start gearing up for that. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about films and TV shows, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.